This podcast episode reflects the opinions of the hosts and guests and not of Greenberg Traurig LLP. This episode is presented for informational purposes only, and it is not intended to be construed or used as general legal advice nor a solicitation of any type.
Hello, and welcome back to Greenberg Traurig's miniseries, Competition Law in the Americas. I'm your host, Miguel Flores Bernés in Mexico City. Today, we're diving into a topic that's top of mind for every business leader: how to build bulletproof compliance and create effective antitrust programs. With new laws and rising enforcement across the Americas, the stakes have never been higher. I'm thrilled to be joined by two outstanding guests: Amparo Martinez, General Counsel at Tiendas Tres B, one of Mexico's best-known hard discount retail chains, and Tonya Esposito, co-chair of the Antitrust Litigation and Competition Regulation Practice at Greenberg Traurig in Washington, D.C., with a deep experience advising global companies on compliance and investigations. Thank you both for being here. We'll break down the new compliance landscape, what makes a program truly effective, and how to turn certification into a competitive advantage. Let's get started. But first, and before we get technical, I want to ask you both, what's the biggest myth or misconception you heard about antitrust compliance programs?
That's a great question, Miguel. And what I would say is, from my perspective, I think one of the biggest myths I've been exposed to throughout my career is that if a company writes a policy, maybe it's a very complex one, maybe it's just a couple pages, conducts some form of training, puts a hotline in place, and sort of claps their hands and says, we're done here, that whole effort is sort of all you need to do from a compliance perspective. I think there really needs to be thought as you develop a compliance program and as you implement it for your particular organization about how that program can remain organic, meaning touch points throughout any calendar year, updates as needed based on things that are happening within the business or the law in general. And then just making sure that you are keeping track of new employees and other things that may be happening within your organization to ensure that it's not just a sort of one size fits all document that is static, that lives potentially in an actual folder or an electronic folder somewhere. And it just sort of, it's like a set it and forget it type thing. I think there really needs to be an ongoing engagement in the area of trying to develop the policy and keep it, as I said earlier, organic.
Thank you, Amparo.
Yeah, I think very similar to Tonya's experience. I believe that the company side, thinking that the compliance programs are policy documents is one of the biggest ones. I think that there's this idea that by having one, then you are protected, like automatically, which is not necessarily the case. Compliance programs do need to be operational and dynamic and mostly, in my opinion, embedded into the decision-making culture of the company, which doesn't happen so often or at least not as often as we would like. And I also think there's a myth on the authority side, which is regularly assuming that leadership always acts in the worst possible intent. And I believe most companies have this prior belief that, well, we do have a program, they just have some lack of tools to implement it sometimes. So I think that makes the antitrust compliance programs requirement that we're going to discuss today really handy.
And Amparo, with Mexico's new competition law that it's introducing important changes, how has this changed your approach in your work as General Counsel? What are the biggest challenges Mexican companies face in adapting to the new requirements?
I think that the reform has reinforced my conviction about the importance of traceability of business decision-making, being able to show how, when, why, and who was involved and what were the safeguards placed when a decision was taken. From a practical standpoint, the reform raises the bar for in-house teams. We now need programs that are truly traceable. As Tonya was saying, are living systems that connect the risk management of our senior executives commercial reality and the law. That's a big change for us internally. In that regard, the biggest challenges maybe are the same as always, I'm afraid. We need to make sure that we turn legal intent, actual operational behavior. Like there's this discipline when taking decisions. And for that, the programs need to be actionable, which is not always as easy. It's easy to write the rule, but it's not as easy to have the senior executives to play the rule in real life situations. That would be one. The second, I think, again, this has been there forever, securing conviction, not just approval from senior management. It's also easy for senior management to approve the policy and to give leeway and even budget to make the trainings and to make a big launch, nice launch of the policies or the programs, but not always there's real buy-in. So buy-in, I think it's crucial. And in terms of budget, I think budget, but not for the function, but for visibility. The fact that the program is always there in the back of everyone's head, in every event, in every decision-making process, in every situation. I think those are the challenges because it's not sexy in many cases to be talking about complying with the rules and complying with antitrust requirements. So I think that those challenges have been there forever. The thing now is that they are becoming more important in terms of the actual explicit terms of law.
And Tonya, what are the latest trends in compliance requirements across the US and internationally? And how are companies responding to increased enforcement and reputational risks?
Yeah, great question. I would say that in the US, as has always been the case, the agencies are expecting companies to have fully sort of mature, risk-based, documented compliance programs. And so that has not changed. I mean, that has certainly been an expectation here of the regulators for quite some time. But what has changed is there's been upgraded guidance, for example, including labor market guidance and an articulation of the DOJ's evaluation factors for that issue and for compliance programs generally. And so it's really important to, as the corporation, stay on top of what the FTC and the DOJ are saying there, but also being cognizant of those factors. And as I mentioned earlier, making sure that you take a look at your policy, I would say at least annually, to ensure that what it contains and how your program is being rolled out aligns with what the regulators are articulating at that particular point in time. So we've had lots of change, if you will, of late here in Washington amongst all the regulators. And so that's certainly no different than what we're seeing currently in the space that involves antitrust. But again, just being aware, being engaged, and making sure that your team is making adjustments and that the culture is one that's open to those types of adjustments too. As I said earlier, having a policy that was drafted 15 years ago and sits in a folder somewhere is certainly unlikely to meet the articulated standards of the regulators in the United States. As for the EU, we've seen pretty aggressive enforcement and large fines in cartel and abuse cases. And similarly, the regulatory authorities there are increasingly publishing compliance guidance and thoughts on how best to obviously avoid being in violation of any antitrust laws, but also thoughts that can be gleaned from the cases they're bringing that are cartel cases and abuse cases. And so, again, I think if you're doing business in the EU and elsewhere, making sure, similar to what I just said about the United States, that you're just sort of annually taking stock of what's happening, not only from an enforcement perspective, but also any change in the expectations as articulated by the regulators in any particular jurisdiction. And then just a point about harmonization, I think that we are all, to some extent, aware of the risks that AI pose in relation to supplier or price-related controls and cross-border coordination. And so I'm sure we'll talk about this a few more times throughout our time together today, but AI is certainly something that I think is at the top of all general counsel's list, and certainly the regulators are very focused on it. So I think that is one point that it is a trend across the board, if you will.
Yes, AI is in all of our minds all the time these days. And for both of you, can you share a real world example of the costs, financials or reputational, of getting compliance wrong?
Yeah, I would just say that I have in my career worked with clients who have sort of been blindsided, if you will, by the potential repercussions of not having an appropriate compliance program, or in some situations, not having one at all. And so I think that the potential repercussions, getting it wrong, could be very, very substantial, particularly in situations where you're dealing with a regulator who is going to perceive a lack of a compliance program as a complete disregard for the law. Whereas the flip side of that coin is if you find yourself in a situation where a regulator has opened an investigation or is just making an inquiry of your business, and you're able to show them, look, we take compliance very seriously. We have a very thoughtful, robust compliance program. Here's how we implement it. Here's how we revise it each year. Here's sort of what we are communicating to our employees. Here's how we engage outside counsel to help reinforce some of these compliance measures. I think that speaks volumes, and in many cases can work to mitigate any potential fine or remediation measures that may be on the table where there's a potential or actual violation of the law. And so, yeah, I think that, and having a wrong size compliance program is equally challenging and creates similar risk, right? If you've got a company that is engaged in all sorts of activities that are potentially not covered by a compliance or an antitrust policy or compliance program you have in place, and you're not paying attention to how you need to right-size that policy, I think you can similarly create lots of risk.
To Tonya's point, there's a very recent example here in Mexico from a big player in the retail sector that was fined by the Mexican Competition Authority in late 2024. And I happen to know for a fact that this player did invest in creating compliance programs over the time, particularly on antitrust. But again, to Tonya's comment, maybe, and I don't know this for a fact, but maybe it was having proper checking points or making sure that the recurrence of the program was the appropriate one. I think that this case in particular goes to show that regardless of whether a company having programs in place, companies can be subject to scrutiny at any point. And regardless of whether the authority is right or wrong, because I know the specific case is being litigated, the sole revision can generate those costs, financial, reputational, and administrative. The scrutiny itself, the internal disruption, the reputational noise, the media, the tension with commercial partners, all of that has a cost in itself and takes a hit in the company. So I think that's a very recent for Mexico and Latin America, because this is a really big company operating all across the continent. It comes to show that compliance programs are important, and following up on them is as crucial as having them in place.
Right. Now, going to the anatomy of an effective program, Amparo, what are the essential elements you look for in a compliance program? And how do you integrate antitrust risk assessment with your broader compliance efforts?
I think you've heard me say this before. They need to be operational. I think that's the single most important thing. I'll let Tonya tell us your opinion on this, but I think it's the single most important thing on a program, that it actually operates. And for that, I believe that a program needs to be based at least on 3 pillars. 1, tailored risk mapping. If you are not truly aware of the industry you're working with, who are your competitors, your distributors, your suppliers, your customers, how does your industry work? And I mean this for the in-house legal department. And you just go and take the FTC guide and copy it. That's not going to work, because it doesn't relate to your actual situation and your actual problems. Second, embedding compliance in the business process. If it's not in the back of the minds of the executives when they're negotiating, when they're setting commercial terms, making a joint venture, it's hardly going to work. And the third one, I think that Tonya was touching on this, traceability in terms of being able to not only reconstruct the rational of decisions, but also being able to show to evidence to the authority that the problem was there, that the training was there, that the follow-up was there. I think that if you have those three elements, regardless of your industry or your size or your particular situation, you are bound to have a better functioning program that if you just, again, go and copy something else or ask a law firm to prepare you a piece of paper that may or may not be reflective of your real commercial situation.
Right. And regarding the integration of the antitrust risk assessment with other broader compliance efforts, how would you recommend to do that?
I found that what works is bundling the training models along with anti-corruption and ESG and other matters that require regular compliance. It improves retention, minimizes fatigue. People don't like to be called by the legal team to a training, and people don't like to have to sit in their computers and take half an hour of their lives to complete a training. So if you sort of bundle the whole compliance structure of the company and make sure that it is in the minds of the executives, I think that works. I personally bring the antitrust issue at the slightest provocation, but bundling it seems to work, at least in my experience. I don't know about others, but with me it has worked.
And Tonya, how do you advise multinational clients to tailor their programs for different jurisdictions?
That's a great question, of course, and can be challenging when you're dealing with a company that's doing business in many, many places. And I've worked with clients in a number of industries to sort of navigate this issue. I think the most important place to start really is to do sort of what I like to call a regulatory map and risk registered, right? Like, so sort of listing out where are you doing business, right? Either brick and mortar or virtually, where are we? And many times it's all over the map. And then from that basis, look at what the applicable laws are, regional, local, et cetera, have an understanding, and not necessarily a super deep dive, but just to sort of have a good understanding of how competition is being regulated in that particular jurisdiction. And an important part of that certainly too is knowing, do these competition authorities have a leniency or cooperation program? Are there particular sectoral risks? Have there been trends in these particular jurisdictions that we should be aware of because they somehow relate to the business or some activity that we're engaged in? So that's sort of like step one for me, is having that map. And I'm a very visual person, visual learner. So I actually like to create a map and then like draw it out on the map and handwriting, and then go from there to create sort of outlines. Another component to that, to some extent, is to understand, is there anything about the local culture or business customs that's important to know? Are you doing business rather in a jurisdiction where lots of things aren't done formally, they're done more informally, right? And are there likely to be just other sort of aspects of doing business in a particular jurisdiction that might be helpful to know for context when you're building out a global compliance program? If you're going to at any point have to engage with other lawyers in that jurisdiction, but also regulators, to sort of just have an understanding of how those interactions may go. Because I have also been in situations where a lawyer from the US will sit in a meeting with, for example, Korean competition authority folks and not have a good understanding of how that regulatory program works in Korea, and some customs that I think are just super helpful for purposes of putting together a thoughtful program. So I always like to think about those points as well. As far as developing training or an investigations handbook or any kind of a playbook, I think it's really important to identify folks within specific regions that can serve as ambassadors or compliance champions, or just sort of help with specific aspects of something that might be local to that particular jurisdiction. Not suggesting you're going to have an antitrust training guru in every place you have, and having individuals identified on your team that you can rely on and communicate with about specific issues should they come up in a particular jurisdiction that might be different from where you are. Certainly, again, going back to one of the original points I made, just staying fresh and aware of changes that happen in the whole sort of world of competition law across the globe, and not only being focused on what's happening right in the United States or what's happening in the EU, but beyond. To think more globally, particularly if you're doing business in those jurisdictions, but if you have ambitions to do business in those jurisdictions, because as we all know, competition law is growing and developing every day. And so we need to know about as lawyers. So those were kind of my big picture thoughts.
Right. Thank you. And for both of you, what's one practical step companies of any size can take to strengthen their compliance right now?
I think that reviewing how decisions are being documented may be helpful. And in line with what Tonya was saying, if the business team and the legal team pair up, and the legal team, for example, helps the commercial team articulate the rationale behind their decisions based on precedents, based on what's happening in their own jurisdiction or other jurisdictions from a strictly antitrust perspective, that might help when facing a scrutiny from an authority. Regardless of the company size, the ability to explain why a commercial decision was made, who proposed it, who validated, what risks were discussed. When facing this scrutiny, the discipline of being able to trace it will not require complex systems and will help demonstrate either good faith or reasonableness if there's some sort of constraint of the authority. And I think that doesn't require any particular training or investment. It's just disciplining, being able to explain and articulate clearly why did a company in a given situation or a given industry handle itself the way they did, and take away these potential constraint of an intent, abuse, or coordination, or any other constraint the authority may have. I think that might work.
Tonya, any practical steps companies of any size can take?
Yeah, I would just say that you might want to call it a mini audit or a high-risk process review, but maybe take a 60 or 90-day period where you think about some of the processes where competitor contact is likely to be frequent, right? And sort of, so for example, sales, pricing, procurement, HR, recruiting, perhaps, and just think about, map some touch points there and think about sort of what those processes look like, and maybe just study them for a very short period of time, not because you want to shine a spotlight on any particular individuals, but just better understand what those processes are. And with that knowledge, and having taken a very focused look at those processes for a limited period of time, think about where there might be additional controls that would be put in place, or where you might be able to just make some quick adjustments that could mitigate some of the activities or some of the problematic things that go on in those areas, and just try to make adjustments to avoid liability going forward.
Great advice. I'm turning now to training and digital tools. And Amparo, what technical solutions or digital tools have you found most effective for monitoring and reporting compliance? And how do you keep your training programs relevant and engaging for employees?
On tools, I think that the most useful ones are those that automate monitoring of risk-prone practices, as Tonya was saying, supplier agreements, cross-promotions, exclusivity clauses, third-party intermediates. Most even big companies do operate through third parties, and sometimes they are not even, or they may not be even aware of certain conducts that may put them at risk. So anything that helps you automate that will help you keep track of it more closely, and it's easy to handle. So I think that those, I wouldn't go to any complicated software or programs. If you have something that helps you, an automatized SharePoint or a person keeping very good track of your Excel, that should be helpful, even if it's not state-of-the-art AI software. And on the training programs questions, I don't know if I keep them relevant and engaging. You should probably ask the team. But my goal is to make them approachable and practical. That's what's worked for me. And what I try to do is I try to use real-life examples of the situations our managers or executive seniors might face in their day-to-day work. specifically or especially in commercial and procurement contexts. That usually helps, and people tend to engage and relate to it. And I also try to scare them a little bit, and I try to include a few cases where things have gone wrong for big players. That tends to resonate more than the abstract rule. Again, when you call people in for training, they don't go with high expectations. They're trying to check the box and just get on with their work. So ultimately, through those examples, what I try to do is help them focus on situational thinking. I want them to recognize the risks more than follow a legal definition or a rule that's been set by the legal department. And when they sort of start seeing the patterns in those examples, then they can react to them when it happens to them in real life. So I think that that's worked so far. But again, you should probably ask my teams if they feel engaged or that the information that has been given to them is relevant. I hope they say yes.
I'm sure they will do. And Tonya, what digital tools are US companies using to automate compliance and reporting? And how do you recommend companies test and continuously improve their compliance programs?
I think that one thing I've seen work very well in terms of tools that companies are using for training is allowing things to be on demand. So certainly requiring the input, and the participant has to sort of make sure they're engaged, not just sitting and watching the video. So making it interactive is the word I'm trying to say, apologies. Interactive training that's on demand, that is timely, but convenient, right? So trying to assemble a group of 10 or 15 employees in a conference room as it was many years ago, it's challenging sometimes. It's costly. Sometimes folks are in different places throughout the organization, and it can lead to having to delay and potentially not wanting to get the training done as quickly as possible. So I've seen companies pivot to having either internal or outside counsel or some combination of the two develop and sort of record and prepare a really good training that can be rolled out to folks who can take it at their leisure. Of course, all of that will be tracked, and there can be follow-up for access to folks if they have questions. But my point is that allowing all that to be sort of done on demand, I think, has really shifted the way companies can roll out compliance training to employees without having to make it sort of so rigid or a once a year thing. It could be multiple times throughout the year, as many times as needed. And then the other thing that I think still remains very relevant we'll call it a hotline platform, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a telephone conversation. It could be, but I think just having a dedicated email box where someone could send a question and say, hey, I got this question. I got sort of somehow found myself in this particular situation. I have concerns, or I've been asked for this type of information from a competitor. I don't think I can share it. I need a little bit of guidance. Having a dedicated email box where folks could send questions like that, and then making sure that there's a live body or two on the other end able to respond to it. Even though it's not very sophisticated technology, it's just email. I do think that is a very effective way for folks to feel as though they have an outlet to immediately ask questions or engage with someone if they find themselves in a situation where they need some guidance.
Great. Now, I want to ask you both if you can share an anonymous example of compliance program that help a company avoid liability or reduce penalties. What are some common pitfalls you've seen, and how can companies avoid?
What I would say is compliance programs that have helped, in my experience, clients who are facing potential antitrust liability have been all of the things I've mentioned, right? So sort of organic. They are revised at least once a year, but sometimes multiple times in any given year. They cover every aspect of the business. There are certainly hotlines and all of those touch points for individuals to reach out if they have questions. They're circulated frequently and accessible to individuals either on a SharePoint site or somewhere, right, within the company's infrastructure so that folks don't have to go searching for the policy. And they're the right size for the organization, meaning if you're doing business in the US and the EU and Latin America and other places, the policy is covering all these jurisdictions. It's not just sort of a one-size-fits-all sort of compliance program that is sort of a check the box exercise. It's clear that someone has put effort into developing the program, thinking about the culture of the business, thinking about ways in which things could change, being amenable to change, but more importantly, and I don't even know if I've mentioned this up until this point, setting a tone of compliance from the top down, right? So making it clear that the money, the time, the investment of this particular company in developing this compliance program is important, and it is sort of part of the company's culture and one that is supported fully and enforced at the highest levels of the company, right? It's not just some document that legal said, hey, you need to sort of circulate this to everyone and make sure they sign saying they received it and on about your day, right? It really is sort of taken very seriously, and that includes folks at the highest level of the company. I think those are all the characteristics of a compliance program that are seen by regulators as effective and complete.
Yeah, just to add on what Tonya said, to derive from her exposure, from her exposition, the pitfalls, I think that delegating the compliance, antitrust compliance or compliance of any other type solely on the legal team, that's a huge mistake. If it doesn't permeate in commercial team, then this whole discussion that keeps rising about legal being a brake instead of being an enabler will keep going on, because to the extent it's not natural, it's not organic to the commercial procurement teams, among others, then it doesn't matter how nice your program is and how recurrent it is or how frequently circulated it is. As Tonya said, if it's not organic, it will very likely fail.
Okay, now I'm turning to the new features on the Mexican law. And the new law provides for voluntary certification of compliance programs before the competition authority. And Amparo, I would like to ask you, what will be the most challenging part of preparing for compliance certification? And what advice would you give to companies just starting or thinking about starting the certification process?
I think it will be the evidentiary standard. I think that the culture has been built over the past years, maybe past couple of decades in Mexico, for companies to actually have their programs in place. I think that we've advanced a little bit on that. But now, as you were saying at the beginning, the stakes are higher. So we need to prove that whatever program you have in place actually works more than it exists. I think that we still don't know how is the Mexican authority going to feel comfortable with what standard are they going to feel comfortable saying, okay, you have your program and your program does actually work. I think that Tonya touched on this, the training, the monitoring, the documenting, the continuous improvement, this revisions or checkpoints she was talking about, those are going to be important. Again, I think that for companies that are just starting the process, I would highly suggest for them to begin with the business and not with the binder. Don't start with a huge manual of 50 pages that's beautifully done. It's better to start with a risk assessment grounded and how your commercial and your procurement teams and your whole company acts. Where are the exposures? Tanya was also mentioning that before. Where are your real antitrust exposures? Sometimes we're chasing ghosts that are not there. Understanding where you really are at risk and bringing the operations and commercial and procurement teams to the room early. If you start building something without their input, it's going to be harder to sell them those manuals or those programs, and it's going to be harder for them to buy them. If you prepare them jointly, I think that should make your path much more easy to work.
And Tonya, are you aware of any other jurisdiction where the competition authority certifies antitrust compliance programs? And in your view, what are the main advantages and disadvantages of having such certification or formal compliance programs?
Yeah, I mean, I have not had the pleasure of going through that process with a client myself, but if I'm not mistaken, I think at least Germany and Korea have some formal evaluation or assessment programs where you can speak to regulators about a proposed compliance program and get like real feedback. And I actually think that Spain has some evaluation tools available to companies that are interested in engaging in that way as well. I think that when you're going through the cost benefit analysis of whether or not you would approach a regulator and say, hey, this is our proposed plan. Like, what do you think? Right? It's a little bit intimidating in the sense that you are opening yourself up as a company to the regulator and potentially exposing areas of weakness or things that might be problematic within the organization just by way of how your compliance program is drafted, and it may not even be intentional, right? And so that's always something to consider, but I'm always an advocate for being transparent when transparency is welcomed and can be beneficial, right? So I would say that if a company is not in the middle of a crisis of some sort or hasn't identified, that's all another conversation we could have, right, about approaching the government during those times. But I do think that it can be an invaluable tool, right, to get feedback from a regulator who is willing to take a look at what you've pulled together and engage in a dialogue about where you might want to consider making some changes. And in most instances, I would think that availing yourself of that type of advice is something that is a good thing to do.
And what are the top 3 things auditors or regulators might look for in compliance programs when they are reviewing them, of course?
I think that Tonya also mentioned the most important, at least in my experience, that they're looking for, the tone at the top. They look for signs that leadership has made it a business priority to make sure that compliance is there. Very recently, I just saw a couple of questionnaires from 2 Week Force, and it's about 40 questions that all relate to tone at the top. It's, I would say, the same question, but presented differently 40 times, just to make sure that it is there. And the other thing they look for is implementation, which is what we've been talking about. The logs of who's been trained, if there are internal alerts, if there's the whistleblower line. That's what they look for. If you have some sort of precedent, then the corrective actions. In my experience, that's basically what they're focusing on.
Let's try a real life example. Let's imagine a company facing a compliance audit. How would a strong program change the outcome versus a weak one?
I think that, as I mentioned previously, I've been in situations where I've represented clients before the agencies, and in some situations, we were able to show very quickly that compliance was something that was taken very seriously at this particular organization. At Amparo, recently, we had this lovely binder. We're going to bring it in. We're going to show you like where we update it each year. We've got certifications or acknowledgments from our employees reflecting that they've taken the training, and we've added more real life examples this year to reflect what's happening in the world of competition globally and all of those things, right? And that truly reflects a culture and a dedication to compliance and a desire to not only root out issues, but to fix them relatively quickly, right? And so it's a culture of transparency, it's a culture of compliance, it's a willingness to make changes when needed, right? Without sort of the barriers of all of the things that sometimes businesses have to deal with relative to managing the world of legal with the business, right? And not really, I guess what I'm trying to say is not having to convince folks within the organization that making a particular change is what's right for purposes of being compliant with the law, as opposed to, or potentially also being a little bit cumbersome for the business, but really sort of creating that culture through the compliance program where everyone understands why the change is necessary and why we have to do this to sort of get our organization to where we need to be. On the flip side, I've also worked with clients in situations where They had a 2-page, I wouldn't even call it a compliance policy. I'd call it an antitrust, quote unquote, policy that was very, very old, hadn't been touched in a very long time. There was no real evidence of anyone at the top truly understanding the importance of compliance and all of the things we've talked about today already in terms of creating the tone from the top and ensuring that everyone within the organization was well aware of why it was so important. And in those circumstances, it is very difficult to convince a seasoned regulator that antitrust compliance is taken seriously within that organization. It's just unfortunate that in that circumstance, antitrust compliance had been somewhat overlooked by this particular entity for a very long time. It was really sort of one of the set it and forget it type situations that I mentioned earlier today. So don't be the set it and forget it. Be the person who has the binder and updates it relatively frequently is my suggestion.
That's a great suggestion. So we're almost running out of time. So we want to wrap it up with 3 practical action points for companies. The first will be, what's the first thing you'd recommend companies to review in their compliance programs today?
Run a quick pulse check of everything that Tonya just said. If your senior and mid-level managers cannot articulate what the program is, where the program is, how does the program work, then that's your starting point. And that's easy as asking. I think that's the first thing I would recommend. Or I'd appreciate someone to tell me or to have told me the first time around. Just ask.
And Tanya, what would be a realistic timeline and budget for implementing a robust antitrust compliance program?
That is a great question. I really think that it depends on the size of the organization. Number one. Number two, what's the starting point, right? Are we starting from scratch? If we're not starting from scratch, perhaps you have that 2-page policy that might be somewhat of a starting point, or maybe you have something that's a little bit more mature. If so, it's determining how much more beyond what you have is actually necessary. And so to some extent, it's a little bit of studying the business, understanding how the organization has grown, because what I always tell clients is I love talking to you and working with you and forming relationships with you, but I want to help you get it right the first time. So that way the investment you've made is one that we can leverage going forward, right? And we can make adjustments annually. You can do a training annually, but you're not going to make this heavy investment multiple times. Having said that, I mean, I have worked with clients of all sizes to develop and implement compliance programs, some as little as $20,000 and others upwards of a couple $100,000. So I really just think it depends on, again, how much you need, size of the organization, and quite frankly, the level of cooperation from the most senior folks within the company often dictates how much things will cost too. Because if you have management that is all in and already signed up and not resistant, it often makes things a little bit easier to just kind of get the train moving and make everything happen. Sometimes I have to spend a dedicated portion of time educating folks on what this is, why we're doing it, why is it important. And there's a lot of convincing that I think has to happen, and that can be expensive sometimes. So just a thought.
And just a final question for both of you. What are the key performance indicators you use to measure program effectiveness?
I like the one that Tonya mentioned before. I was going to say awareness and engagement just very generally, but proactive questions, I think that those are really indicators that you've cracked the nut. And behavioral metrics. If you start hearing people use the words, if you start seeing in meetings or conference calls that someone brings up the topic, hey, should we be talking about that? Hey, let's be careful with this or that. I think that those are real indicators, like live indicators that your program is working. There are others, the number of persons that actually took the training, and if you have enough signatures and stuff. But I think that those are really nice indicators that you're getting through the mindset of the company.
Tonya?
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that when you start seeing those questions come through an email box or you start getting phone calls, it really it's striking how you're able to discern, okay, that training I gave last month really connected because they identified this issue and they came to me with it. And even though it's not really an issue and I can talk them through it so they understand sort of how it fits into the world of antitrust compliance, I would much rather have those 10, 15-minute conversations a couple times a month, right, than have folks not be checked in, not really understand what's happening, and for there to be unfortunate situations that are, exchanges of information or other types of things that are problematic. So I couldn't agree more. I really think it's the feedback you get from the folks who are sort of learning from what you're training.
Great. Well, that's it for today's episode. A big thank you to Amparo Martinez and Tonya Esposito for sharing their insights and practical advice. Thank you again. We hope you found this conversation helpful for building stronger compliance programs. And thank you for listening and being part of our community. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and share it. And if you have any questions or want to chat more, feel free to email me at mfbernes@gtlaw.com. See you next time.